Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole DeAndrea, and I'm the Assistant Director of Annual Giving and Membership at NYU Libraries. Thank you for joining us today. As you've heard, this event will be recorded for the library's archives. You will have to press continue to approve this. Anyone who is RSVP today will receive the recording link in the coming days in your email. Thank you for coming. Welcome to Read Like a Researcher with NYU Librarian Stephen Maher. This event is part of our Getting to Know series, which showcases the incredible work that our colleagues do every day in a virtual format. We seek to educate and engage while we are socially distanced. We have many more events coming up in this fall, and I encourage you to attend all of them. A few Zoom housekeeping items. You have been muted upon entering the event. This is to alleviate background noise during the presentation. You will be able to ask questions during this presentation. You may type them into the chat box. You can send in a question at any time, but we will wait until the end after Stephen presents to answer those questions. We will get to as many as we can. We have a lot of people on the call today. If you can please turn off your video, it helps for a better connection for everybody. If you would like to use speaker view, where only the person who's speaking is up on your screen, you can enable that option in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. In addition, live closed captioning is available for this event. In order to turn this on, you'll go to the bottom of your screen and press the closed captioning /CC button and select the show subtitle option. Those captions will display in the center of the lower part of your screen. And finally, we will be showing a presentation during this talk, as you can see from this lovely photo of Bopes, so you can expect that screen share to come automatically. I'd like to now introduce our speaker for today. Stephen Maher is a social work and psychology librarian at NYU Libraries. Before that, he was NYU's Health Sciences Library in the 30s, where he was the assistant director for content management and scholarly communication. We are so excited for today's presentation, and I'm thrilled to turn it over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and welcome everyone. This is really humbling today to see such a large turnout. Really excited to present on this topic for you all. In retrospect, I probably should have included an asterisk after researcher, as you know, there's no one way to read like a researcher. Nonetheless, and regardless of the field of study, there are some similarities between how to approach academic, scholarly, or research literature. And that's what I'm going to hope to show you today. So just going to go over our overall goals. These are them. First, I will kind of distinguish what reading like a researcher is from the everyday reading we are all accustomed to. Then I'll show you a few techniques for reading research articles, books, book chapters more efficiently and critically. And because research kind of takes all forms and can come in all different types of shapes, I might just say the text, just so we know that I'm referring to articles and book chapters and all that sort of government documents, that kind of thing. Brief note also, during the course of this talk, we'll look at a particular article as an example, and we're going to use the free software application Adobe Acrobat Reader to mark it up. So hopefully you already have it on your computer. If you don't, it's a-okay. Remember, this is being recorded, as Nicole mentioned, and you can revisit that section and follow along when it's a more convenient time to do so. And then the final goal is to introduce the concept of information awareness and how we can incorporate that into our reading habits. A couple other things I want to add before we get started, although we're already getting started. Keep in mind that these techniques that I'm going to show you will take practice, and there will be circumstances, there'll be times when you're just not going to have the bandwidth to put them to use. That's a-okay. It's also okay to take what I'm going to show you and tailor it to fit your own personal style. Without a doubt, you have your own knowledge and expertise, and hopefully these techniques and concepts will mesh well with them. The other thing I wanted to ask, and it's also been mentioned, please ask questions. We're a big group, so we probably won't get to everyone, but we'll do our best to make sure that we cover the questions that we think everyone can benefit from. So just kind of keep that in mind. And before we get started, or continue to get started, I want to ask you all a question, and that's this. Based on your previous experience, what are some of the challenges you have had with reading the research literature? And you'll see whether that's a book, again, a journal article, book chapter, textbook, what have you. You can submit your response by going to pollev.com with a / and it's my name, and I'll spell it out, STEPHEN, M like medicine, AHER 444. And then you could type out your answer there. You'll probably, when you get to the site, it'll probably ask you to like accept the cookies, but after that you should be all good to just put in your response. And we'll just sit on this slide for a little while and wait for the responses to come. And you know what, I may just test it out myself just to make sure that it's working, because you never know with technology. Oh, there we go. It is working. That was not my response. Creating summaries that are short enough. Really good. Yes. Time management, getting through the volume of printed material. Yes, they most certainly can. Yes, research literature can be boring. And I'm sure if not everyone is responding with their questions, our heads are nodding when we look at this. Yep, jargon, difficult to understand. Yeah, these are all very common things. Maintaining focus, identifying what's important, what's a side note. Yeah, all of the above and so much more. This is great. This is really great feedback. And thank you for sharing all of this. This is excellent. Statistics. Oh, I don't know if we have time to dive into that, but we'll see what we can do. Feeling overwhelmed, being overwhelmed. Yes, yes. Well, okay. Now this is exactly why we are doing this talk. All of your responses, I'm going to hope we can answer a lot of that today. So thank you for everyone who's responded. You know, and these are common challenges. I'm hoping everyone's heads are nodding as we read what's coming up. And a lot of reasons that I've found, like working with students, whether they're just finished undergrad and starting a master's program, or they're lapsed and they've been out of college and university for just a few years or decades. You know, one of the challenges that tends to happen is we treat reading a research article or a research text the same way we read through a novel or scroll through our Facebook or Twitter feeds. And that's kind of what I like to call everyday reading. And this kind of reading is casual, right? It's what we read for entertainment or to be informed. And in both cases, it's kind of like we're being told. You know, we're being told a story, or if we're reading a news article or a magazine, we're being told what happened. And, you know, these sorts of exchanges are kind of one-way exchanges. There's really not expected that kind of like feedback that you were going to get as an audience member necessarily. You know, everyday reading is also something that's kind of, it's maintained linear, it's linear in nature. It's kind of, you read it from cover to cover, as the expression goes. And sometimes some people describe it as passive reading. Not too fond of that term, because you know, everyday reading, not always passive. But in contrast to active reading, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today, it's more purposeful, just to kind of distinguish it. It's more critical and interrogating, interrogative. And you know, with research, the way it's written, it's also kind of expects that interrogation process. It expects that from the readers in this sense. You know, it's more like a dialogue, engaging the reader to question and argue with the ideas that the researchers or authors are presenting. And that it's also aware that the research came before it. So, you know, if, you know, reading a novel or reading a Facebook post or Twitter feed or magazine article, there's not always references at the end, or never references at all. Whereas with active reading, or what we find in research literature, we find references so that we know the context of how we got to this point, how this study came about. And that makes it kind of clear that there's a scholarly conversation going on, a research conversation going on behind the scenes that, as a reader, you're actively engaging in. So active, it kind of goes beyond, you know, reading to summarize, although the summaries are definitely important aspects of active reading. but we're also reading into the text and seeing how it's communicated, and we also bring our own reflection and critique to that. Of course, we do that with passive reading or everyday reading as well, but we leverage that a little bit more when we read research literature, the text as it were. Now, given the life and times of a busy researcher, active reading takes on different forms, and these are them. And these forms reflect the specific purposes and how much time a researcher may have. And with this in mind, a particular text might be read 3 times, because kind of as we're looking at these different types, and at least 3 times, if not more. And before we go into these specific types of active reading, let's take a look at the example research article that we'll be working from today. So here we go. So over in the chat, you'll find a link to this article here. And it's the title is Internalizing Profiles of Homeless Adults, Investigating Links Between Perceived Ostracism and Need Threat. I haven't read this article, so we're all on this, and hopefully no one else has. So we're all kind of on the same boat here. So we're going to be learning as we go, as we kind of read through this, and we're not going to go through the entire article in this case. It's really just going to show the techniques. So there won't be any quiz afterwards or anything like that either. There's also probably a good time to plug how I found this article, because I know some folks here may not necessarily be current students or faculty here at NYU. So a brief plug for the directory of open access journals, and that's how I found this particular article. So if you go to doaj.org, that's where you would get to that site, and it's a community curated online directory that indexes and provides access to high quality peer-reviewed open access journals. So if you're looking for a place to search for open access, quote unquote, free journal articles, this could be a good place to start. And with the fact that it's high quality peer review, it means that it's gone through kind of a standard vetting process where before it's been published, other experts in the respective field have read the article for to make sure that the methodology of the research is sound, that the contribution, what the study is contributing is new and original and kind of carrying the conversation forward. Those sorts of things kind of help us kind of navigate the research waters, if you will, to find out what actually has been verified as quality research. Of course, over time, some theories could be disputed, some practices can be found not to have been sound methodologies, but at least at the present moment when this article was accepted, that's what we know at that point. That's how that process works. So hopefully by now you've gotten the URL opened and it's on your browser. And we'll go and take a look at this article there in a moment. But let's take a look at that first phase of active reading, which was overview reading. And kind of like it's described, it's kind of what you'd expect it to be. It's quick, anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes per article or book chapter or what have you. And it's really the object of this exercise is just to see if the article or text is relevant to the question or interest that the researcher has. Now, for our example article, we'll just all agree that this is relevant to our purpose, and we'll continue using it for our other types of reading. But that's ideally what we're doing with overview reading, is we're just going to scan through it, kind of skim it, and decide whether or not it's relevant to the question that we're trying to answer, the interest that we have for a given topic. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into that website. And here we are, The Frontiers of Psychology is the journal. And if I scroll down a bit, here we have that title again. And a good first practice for anything that we read, whether it's from a book chapter or for a journal article, is we want to transform the title of the text into a question. This helps us set our expectations for what the article or text intends to tell us it's going to do. And whether or not that answer is of interest to us. If it's not of interest to us in the kind of overview phase, we'll just move on to the next search result and look for something else. In this case, we can take the title internalizing profiles of homeless adults, investigating links between perceived ostracism and need threat, to a question like, what are the links between perceived ostracism and need threat among homeless adults? Yeah, it doesn't have to be complicated, but just kind of reframing it will help us kind of decide whether or not this is in fact relevant, or if that answer is meaningful enough for us to keep moving on and reading forward. As we're going through this, we're going to then kind of scroll down and look at the abstract, which we can see right here, to see a summary of the text. And now that we've kind of turned the title into a question, this abstract can kind of inform us on how the researchers, how the authors are going to attempt to answer that question for us. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and you've probably already been familiar with this in the past, kind of looking at websites for journal articles and things like that, they can be a little bit inconsistent. Different things are in different places. So, but one thing we can always look out for, if I'm going to scroll back up here, is we'll find that's kind of like a download article, something like this. And you may as well click on that now because we will be using the PDF to do some marking up. So that's something that we'll find. And it may not be on every place when we do our searching. But the other thing that we may want to look for, and that tends to be consistent across journal publisher websites, are the table of contents, which we'll have here on the left-hand side here. And this is useful for us to jump around and get to the sections that might kind of give us a little bit more information beyond the abstract. So for example, this kind of also speaks to the difference between that everyday reading where we read more linearly to active reading where we're going to jump around through the table of contents to get the information we need to decide if we want to read further. So we've read the abstract, and now what we may do is jump to the conclusion, or in this case, there isn't a conclusion, so we go to that discussion section to see what was found and where the researchers or authors think where the next phase of their research should go, or where they think research in general should go based on this topic. We could also look at the introduction section, particularly toward like the last paragraph or two in that section, to see what the author's hypothesis was. That can also inform how they're going to answer that question that we posed by kind of reframing the title of the article. Now, usually a researcher will conduct the overview reading for several articles at a time. So this is not, this is also one of the things that came up in our question and answer just now was talking about time management. So this is where time management can be really, really critical because it's very enticing to, once you've read an article and determined that it's relevant, to keep reading. It's not exactly what we want to do here just yet, because with the whole process of overview reading, we're really just trying to decide whether or not an article is relevant, if we want to read further. And we're going to be going through several articles at a time to decide what our kind of reading load is going to be for the next phase. So this is a good kind of way to kind of only decide what are the relevant articles, and it's rarely only one article that's going to be relevant. So you want to just kind of use this overview process to decide what is relevant, and then you can kind of decide based on what you've gone through to determine how much time you'll need to then do that next phase of reading later on. So again, like it takes the overview reading can take anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes. Of course, it can go longer or shorter depending on the content. But ultimately, the idea is to basically kind of collect what you want to read later on. And that's kind of the gist of what we're trying to do here. Oh, I keep going in the wrong direction. Sorry, everyone. The next one, the second type of reading is called for getting the gist, or a basic familiarity of the content of the text. Now, this is a common practice for researchers trying to learn more about an unfamiliar topic, or for students who've been assigned a dozen articles a week for a class. It extends beyond that first exercise of converting a title of the article or text into a question, and explores how the authors are going to attempt to answer that question that we posed. In this phase of active reading, researchers will often begin to take notes. So we're trying to identify the new concepts and how they're defined. This is also where we're going to start to summarize some of the key points of the text and how it relates to our own research interests. So this is a good opportunity to take the PDF version of that article that we just found. I found it, but now you have it. And we're going to look at the PDF version and see how we can begin to summarize and do that getting the gist aspect of our active reading process. So I'm just going to toggle over to Adobe Acrobat Reader. First, you'll notice, hopefully this looks similar to your own experience in this software application. So what I'm this to on your end is the bookmarks on the left-hand side that have it all kind of basically the table of contents listed out there on the left. Really handy, super convenient. Unfortunately, it's not always going to be there depending on the publisher and how they formatted their PDF versions of their articles or book chapters. So for the entrance of just kind of using what we can and make it more consistent, we're just going to let that go. So I'm going to close that out here. And also, this is, again, a free version of Adobe. So they're on the right-hand side, they're showing some features that you won't have access to with the free version. So we're going to minimize this as well and just focus on what we see right in front of us and some of these buttons at the very top. So as we scroll through this PDF, we'll see that it's very similar to what we saw on the web page version of the article. The one exception in this case is keywords. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so we can see that a little bit better. So here we have our keywords. And this is usually provided by the authors of the article to succinctly describe what their article is about. And judging from the article's title, a lot of the keywords are already there, and there's certainly some alignment. Keywords are great for getting the gist because we can expect these words to be defined or expounded upon in a way that helps answer that question that we've posed for ourselves. We'll skip the first keyword because I think we have a good idea, understanding of what that term means. But let's focus on the second one, internalizing psychopathology. Now, some of you may already know what that term means, which is great, but still it's going to be useful to look at how the authors define this term in context with their research. Now, to see how the authors are defining or using this term, we can get to that by going to the edit feature, which is all the way in the upper left-hand corner here. And it should be the same if you're on a Mac, relatively pretty much the same. And what we're going to select is the advanced search feature. And what I'm going to do, I should have already pasted it. Great. So internalizing psychopathology. I have that here. I have this box already checked. It might not be checked as a default, but I want that to be checked because I'm going to lowercase the I in internalizing, because we know that internalizing psychopathology or internalizing is in the title. And we don't want that to show up in our results. So that's why we're going to go with the case sensitive option here. And now let's click the search and see what we get. So here we have 35 instances, not surprising considering the title of the article. And what we can do is kind of move around to see where these are. And we'll see them immediately in the abstract, which is great, several times in the abstract. Here we have it in the keywords, and the next section we know is going to be the introduction. And this is where we're going to find how it's been defined by the authors. So let's take a look. So here we see adults internalizing psychopathology, which is characterized by inner distress. So this might be enough of a definition for our purposes. If we're not happy with this, and we just need a little bit more, we could either hunt down this article that they're referencing, or we can Google it. Yes, researchers Google things too. So let's jump over into Google and just do a quick search for that too. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the term internalizing psychopathology in quotes. And the reason why I'm going to do that is I want to make sure that my search results only pull or only retrieve results with that phrase, those two words together. It's a pretty technical term, so it's not surprising that what we'll get is going to fit that definition. But if you're doing a Google search or searching other databases, putting things in quotes can be really useful for getting exactly what you're looking for, especially for phrases, or if you're looking for a title of a specific article or text. That could be another handy way to kind of cut to the chase and get to more precisely what you're looking for. So let me run that search. So the first result pretty much does exactly what we need. It represents the spectrum of conditions characterized by negative emotion. It includes phenomena such as depression, anxiety, and phobias. And if we want to read more, we can click on this link here, and it will take us to that article for more information. So this is where we're getting some of our definitions kind of established here, and we can also a good time that if this wasn't a definition that you were super familiar with, this would be a good time to start writing these things down and including it in your notes, just to kind of facilitate familiarity with some of those concepts, but also possibly to kind of trigger some memorization later on. I'm going to go back to the PDF. Here we are. And let me zoom out a little bit. That should be good. So we know that the introduction section will help us get to those definitions of keywords and those concepts that were identified in the abstract, that kind of thing. As we go through the other sections of getting the gist reading, we will involve kind of brief summaries of these sections. For example, we'll get to the method sections or materials and method sections here, and that's going to summarize how the research was conducted and by whom and on whom. The next section, as we keep scrolling, and we could see as we scroll that there's subsections here that also will be useful for framing how the methods were done, how the research was conducted. And now the next section, major section, is the results, where it's going to be the most kind of research jargon heavy. It's also where we're going to find the tables and figures, and we can spend another hour just talking about tables and figures. But for getting the gist reading, we're going to really just refer to where the tables were referenced in the text and how they were summarized. To look at their measure and their conclusion. So for example, like this here, feeling ignored as a predictor, table 4 is where the model of feeling ignored as a predictor of need threat is shown. And then we can see the result was feeling ignored was a significant predictor of need threat. If we scroll down, we'll actually see table 4. So if we want to interpret this, we could, but we could also just go with the text here to understand what meaning was found or displayed in that table. We could also absorb a lot of this information as we keep scrolling in the discussion section. And this is where we're going to see the authors explain the significance of their results, the limitations of the study, which will be really useful, as well as where the researchers think this research needs to go on from here. So for note-taking purposes, with getting the gist, this usually looks like short summaries for these particular sections. Or if you really want to get detailed, you can basically jot down one-sentence summaries for each paragraph. All depends on how much time you have and how thorough you are with the articles. Most of these summaries, though, kind of get us to answer that question that we posed early on in the overview phase of things. So with our question of what are the links between perceived ostracism and need threat among homeless adults, we would begin our answer with the authors found and then go on from there. So that's basically how we would use that getting the gist kind of phase of the active reading process. Let me toggle back to our slides. Uh-oh, hang on a moment. Sorry, just a moment here. Here we go. the third phase. Here we are. So this is the most in-depth aspect of active reading, and this is where we're going to do that more critical and analytical kind of reading and activity at this phase. It's the longest phase, of course, and even the 30 to 45 minutes, your mileage may vary depending on what you're familiar with and that sort of thing. But as a researcher at this point, or as having read through the articles through the getting to gist part, or having gone through the overview process, you found a bit of your footing to understand some of the concepts behind the articles at this point. So you've read dozens of articles probably on this topic at this point, and you have an understanding of, say, internalizing psychopathology. So here is when you might critique whether that definition that you found and that you're familiar with across several articles and other texts that you're accustomed to have read over time, you're going to look at that definition that the authors use and see how it matches your understanding and application of that term. This is also where you're going to examine the evidence and the methods of the results of the study, identifying its strengths and looking at the limitations that both the authors provided and kind of self-disclose as the limitations to their research, but also limitations that you've discovered in the course of looking at the methods and results sections of the article as well. And you're also going to critique how well the authors communicated their process and their findings. This is the most reflective section of the active reading process, although we're reflecting at all times, whether we're reading a novel or a research text. But this is where it really invites you to intentionally add your knowledge and expertise in response to what you have read. And it's likely that you will read this article more than once to really kind of thoroughly examine its contents. So just going to keep that in mind. It's okay to read things more than once as you're going through this process. So now that we've gone through the three types of active reading, we've got overview, we've got getting the gist, we've got critical and analytical reading, let's go over a tool and a technique that might help the process make it a little bit more manageable. And the first is this alphabetical mnemonic device known as PQRST. Now, PQRST stands for preview, question, read, summarize, and test. And all of these steps appear in aspects of the overview, getting the gist, and critical and analytical reading. With preview, we skim read the text, paying attention to how it's organized, the titles, subtitles, and we'll get to that specifically, those titles and subtitles in a minute. With question, we identify the question the text is attempted to answer. And we've done that with kind of converting the title of the text into a question. But it doesn't have to be limited to the overall title. It could be other things that we pull out of, say, the abstract or from the conclusion as we're kind of moving around throughout the text itself to think of questions that we're expecting it to answer for us. Next, we read, which is basically a slower version of skimming. So we're reading at our own pace to look at the details that help us arrive at the answer that we expect to find. With summarize, we saw this with getting the gist. We translate what we've read into a form that we can understand more easily and communicate the main ideas that we found within the text. This is central to getting the gist reading, but also we add our reflections here for more of the critical and analytical reading as well. And the last step is test, where we revisit that initial question or questions that we posed and attempt to answer them in our own words. This is also where we test is a kind of way that we examine the text and how well it communicated its process and its findings. Now, all of these steps will encourage active reading. But one step that sometimes we all take for granted, especially when we're in the habit of kind of more everyday reading, is for objective. Just kind of a clear rationale for why we're reading the research will really help ground us in the process. Asking yourself why you want to read about this particular research or scholarship, maybe even writing it down, writing down the why can really help take hold of your curiosity and stay focused. It's kind of like in yoga, they talk about like setting an intention before starting start yogaing. Probably not a word. This kind of that sort of thing, that sort of practice of this kind of identifying why you're reading something or why you're going through the process of looking for these sorts of articles, this sort of text, can really help ground the process. For students who've got, who've been assigned dozens of articles every week for their courses, this is where you would rely on your syllabus, because typically for each week or each class, it'll be outlined like these articles that have been assigned or these texts that have been assigned are about a given topic. And that's the why associated with that week's or that class's assignment. So that's another reason why the syllabus can be important and worth kind of referring back to from time and time again over the duration of your courses. Something to keep in mind if you're doing that thing right now, if you're still in student mode. Technique-wise, text mapping could be a really useful way of kind of addressing all of these things, but particularly the overview process. It's a visual approach, you can kind of tell, which we would use during that overview and then that preview step to mark up the text to see how it is structured and how it all kind of comes together. The analog version of this is when you would basically print out the pages or photocopy them if you're coming from a physical book, and then you'd create that scroll, which you kind of see on the screen, from left to right. And then with pens and highlighters, we would just start to mark up the text. So for example, we would highlight the subsections of the text and then draw boxes around the introduction and conclusion sections. This sort of visualization can be useful in the overview stage to estimate how much time it will take for a more thorough reading later on. So that's kind of the idea behind text mapping. And it's by kind of laying it all out there, it also kind of shakes up the idea that you have to read this text linearly. You don't. Once you have it all kind of spread out like this, you know that you can move around through the document, through the text as you want to, as you wish. Now, the digital version of this is a lot easier in my opinion. So we're going to jump back into the PDF and I'm going to show you how to kind of mark up your text to make it work like this. So we have all that there. Oops, we'll come back. Okay, so here we are back in our PDF. And let me scroll back to the very top of the page here. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to go to View, which is on the upper left, just to the right of Edit. And I'm going to change the page display to a 2-page view. And that's going to make this practice a little bit easier to manage because really we're not reading here. We're really just identifying kind of the subtitles and titles of the text. And also can't draw a box, unfortunately, with Adobe Acrobat Reader. The free version doesn't allow us to draw boxes, but we can work around that by using underline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize it a little bit further so we can kind of look at all this text here. And I'm going to, highlight some of this text. And automatically it's going to ask me what I want to do with it. Now I could highlight it, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to underline it. And if I right click on this, I can change the properties of my underline. And right now the color is black. I'm going to change it to red because I think it's going to visually pop a little bit more. And just in case you want to change the style, the straight style is like a straight underline. But there's also a squiggly, which it looks a little bit more pronounced. So another technique that you might want to consider as you're using this. And because we're just going to use the underline feature just to identify the introduction and in this case the conclusion or discussion section, I'm going to make this a default. So it's locked in when I underline the rest of these sections. So I'll click OK. Just make sure we get the whole text here. I can underline, and there's the last section of the okay, and I'll just jump around to the end. This is our discussion section, so it's really the final section. I'm going to underline that. And you want to kind of do it page by page, because if you can kind of see as I toggle over to the next page, it's highlighting the page number and the basically kind of like the metadata about the journal. We don't necessarily need that. I mean, it's not a big deal, but just to be a little precise. And we'll get the last page here. I'll underline that. And now in terms of our subsections, I mean, certainly the references, acknowledgements, funding, author contributions, ethics statement, it's certainly important, but for our purposes, we'll probably spend the least amount of time on those sections. So I'm just going to highlight the discussion, results, methods, and introduction sections by clicking highlight text. The highlight here is orange. I'm not sure about that, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to click on properties. And let me change that color to something a little bit lighter and contrastier to the underlying colors. So I'll go with a lighter blue. Here we have results. I'm going to make this a little bit, let me zoom in a little bit so it's a little bit more pronounced. Oh, let me change that. Go again to properties, made my own mistake. I want to make my properties default, so I'm going to change it to that light blue. Click on that checkbox and click OK. And up the top here we have our methods and materials. And then that final page, page 1, we'll get to the introduction, highlight that. Now, how do we make that kind of text mapping, kind of that scroll? Here's how we do it. Over here on the left-hand side, we have this icon for page thumbnails. I'm going to click on that. You can already kind of see it. You can really see that pronounced sort of underlined text there. Now to kind of make it scroll from left to right, in between these two, this scrolling bar here in kind of a lightish gray, if you mouse over that, you'll see an icon to basically stretch this pane. So I'm going to stretch this to the right as far as I can. And now I can see how it's all been outlined. And what we have at the end here we have our discussion section and our introduction section, and these sections will be our methods and our results. And then what we have after that is the references. The reason why this can be useful for a kind of visualization purposes, it's going to tell us how much of the article we'll actually have to read to kind of get to the answer that we want. And this is going to be useful if we're going through the preview or overview phase of things. This kind of tells us how much time we're going to need to kind of go through the articles that we've decided to be relevant for our research topic or question that we're trying to answer. So that's kind of the idea for creating that scroll. I'm going to zoom back. And if we want to zoom in, we could also use this icon over here to make it a little bit, if we want to see those sections like that light blue, it's a little bit more pronounced there. So let me jump back to our slides. Signal words is another kind of technique that we can utilize for kind of that visual kind of breakdown like we saw with text mapping. So with signal words, we're basically using how the authors communicate their emphasis, their contrast, their examples, their cause and effect, and we're using all of that to kind of find those keywords in the text. So like for emphasis, some of those kind of those common words that we might find are like central or primary or significant. We might look for, like in terms of contrast, likewise, similarly, or in contrast, like specifically those words or how those phrases are utilized in the text to kind of see where the authors kind of pivot from idea to idea. Or like with illustration, if they're trying to kind of demonstrate or find an example, for example, just looking for that phrase in the text could be a useful way to kind of find those shifts in how they're communicating their ideas. So this is something that we'll definitely want to look out for. And you can see, like, as we use our text, as we use our highlighters, whether it's like the analog version where we have our printed pages, we would use our highlighters for these sorts of sections. You can change the colors as you see fit. But we could also do that in Adobe Acrobat in the digital version. So let's just show you how that would work. So here we are back in our text. Let me minimize this thumbnails. Actually, I'll just close it out here. So we're back on our 2 pages, which is fine. I'm going to go back at the top to edit and use that same advanced search that we used to find the definition or how it was defined of internalizing psychopathology. I'm going to go to advanced search here. I'm going to search for something different. So I'm going to use some of those signal words to see what comes up. Let's try significant. In the case sensitive part, it doesn't necessarily matter, but we'll leave it as it is and see what comes up. So significant seems to be a popular word within this group, maybe too popular. So, but no, all the same, if we wanted to kind of highlight where this is all used, first off, we want to kind of start from the top, and we see that significant shows up in the abstract. That's useful, but we've already read the abstract during that overview phase. So when it comes to like getting the gist or that critical and analytical reading portion of our topic, this is where we want to kind of pull it up in those sections. So I'm just going to jump around a little bit. Here we see it's showing up in our results section, in our method section as well. So what I'll do is I'm just going to highlight just by holding on the shift key and then the down arrow. And you can see over in the right-hand corner there, significant is starting to get highlighted. Now all I need to do is click on the highlight icon, and now all those words are highlighted. Granted, they're all highlighted in that same light blue color, so I might want to change that later on, or change that color first and then make those changes. But that's what we would do for identifying those kind of signal words in the text. And that way, when it's time to read more critically or analytically, this is going to be useful for us to kind of find those certain words. So let's go back to those slides. We're getting toward the end, and want to take a few minutes to talk about information awareness. So, now a lot of research that we find on the internet can be cost prohibitive because of subscription costs. And fortunately, titles and abstracts typically are free. So we can view those right away, and we can utilize the journal websites to see anything that they have published relevant to our objective that we've identified already. We can also use free databases like PubMed to search biomedical literature. We can also use a website like Google Scholar to search information about research across multidisciplines. Another resource that can be particularly useful for folks living in New York is the research section of the New York Public Library. Let me just jump into that really quick. You'll just find that over here under research. Eventually. And what's useful about this is a lot of the same databases that we make available through NYU are also available there. And if you're looking for kind of specific multidisciplinary databases to kind of cover a wide range of topics, some ones that you'd want to consider looking at under access to databases. You can use something like Academic Search Premier is one that we use a lot. JSTOR is another one, which is down over here. And Credo Reference is another one that could be useful. The latter is actually particularly useful as you come across words or concepts you're not familiar with. They can provide more complete definitions to what the author provided. So that's another option. We did Google search internalizing psychopathology, but we could also look it up in Credo Reference as well. Now, if you're not living in New York City or working in New York City, your local public library or state library may also have access to these databases, so it's worth inquiring with them. You may also want to check with your local university in your town to see if they offer access to people in the neighborhood. Pre-COVID-19, that might come in the form of visitor passes to the physical library, but it's worth inquiring with them all the same, just to see what's changed now that we're in different circumstances. Of course, if you're a current NYU student, you have the NYU Library website that you can access a variety of databases, including the ones I just mentioned that are available through the New York Public Library, that can connect you to the full text of the articles or book chapters, what have you, that you're looking for. But remember, the point is not to immediately acquire that text. That first step is still to preview and do that overview to see, whether or not this research text is relevant. So it's good to kind of pump the brakes and kind of start slow and just kind of see what's out there. Use the technique of reframing the question, the title into a question, and looking at the abstract to see how that question might be answered. Information awareness is more about keeping abreast of the new research areas in your field of interest. And this can be accomplished by making a habit to review the table of contents of relevant journals, or creating personal accounts in some of these sites, some of these databases and search engines, or if you're using Google Scholar, you can create alerts. So if we were to do a search for, say, homelessness and mental illness, once we have that done, I can go to the 3 bars here at the top, and I can create an alert for that. So here I have this, and then it would send an email to my civilian Gmail account. But I can also create an alert for new ones and have it work that way. Let's jump back to the slides. We're almost done. Thank you so much for bearing with me as we go through all of this. Some final thoughts, just kind of answering a lot of the questions that you've already kind of, a lot of the answers that you already kind of posed in my initial question. Scheduling time for reading and rereading is going to be really kind of essential to this, and that's why that kind of 3 phases of active reading can be really useful. So, blocking off an hour for that quick overview reading, you're going to cover a dozen or so articles to see whether they're potentially relevant. And then in that process, you'll also see, well, for the articles that are relevant, how much time you'll need to read to get the gist of those articles, and then moving on from there. Leveraging the structure of the text, we kind of covered that with text mapping and signal words. Really just once you have the PDF version of the text, kind of use those tools that Adobe Acrobat has to highlight the aspects of the text, both how it's structured and how the authors kind of pivot and communicate their discoveries and their findings in the research. And then the last thing, writing down the questions and whether it's the question that you want the article, that you expect the article to answer for you and its answer, but also those unfamiliar terms and the definitions of those terms as well. So I was promised to run this a little bit shorter, so my apologies for going a little bit over time, but now we can open it up for questions, and I'll stick around a little bit later because I did run a little bit more than spoke a little bit longer than I intended to. So thank you for listening, and let's see what questions are out there.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So again, as I said in the beginning, please feel free to ask questions via the chat. We have a couple coming in. I also want to say something about the New York Public Library membership. I recently learned this and I wanted to mention it to this group. Any person who lives, works, attends school, or pays property taxes in New York State, not just city, state, is eligible to receive a New York Public Library card for free and therefore use those research tools that Stephen talked about. So again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and I'm going to tackle, we have 2 in there. So someone wrote me specifically and asked, Stephen, if you can spend a second to suggest tips and or ways to assess how robust or valid a publication is, like the journal it's published in, that kind of thing.
That's a great question. So if we can I'm going to toggle back to that Frontiers of Psychology. Just as an example, on the websites, you'll find this term impact factor, and you'll see it over here in the upper right-hand corner. So impact factor is a bit of a tricky thing, and I'll try to explain it as quickly as I can, but essentially what this is measuring is relative to the area of subject. So like in the case of psychology, for instance, this is the impact factor measuring how often an article is cited, articles cited within this journal. So, the more popular kind of journals that are not just limited to one subject area, so say like the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet, their impact factor is in the double digits, if not higher than that, depending on like when it's tabulated every year. But essentially what they're measuring is how often articles from these journals have been read and then used in other research. So that can be a way of determining, the relevance of the journal that the article was published in. Another thing to look at, though, I'm going to jump back into Google Scholar really quick. Sometimes Google Scholar will show you in the results is how often an article was cited. So like in this case, homelessness and mental illness from 1993 in the British Journal of Psychology, it's been cited 268 times. We can click on that to see cited by whom, and that can be useful because just because something has been cited, it doesn't necessarily mean it's been cited in a positive way, because sometimes, things can be disputed or, say like this is an example of poor science or poor methodology. Sometimes that happens. So you want to take a lot of this information with a grain of salt. But that's a way of looking at how this research has been received within its field and with other scholars who are looking at it. So that's another way of kind of assessing it. Assessing the journal on its own can be a little bit hazardous because you never know, that it's being measured across all of the articles, whereas if you're looking at one specific article, that may very well answer the question that you're interested in. So take that into consideration as well.
Thank you. So there's next question I can tackle is, can alumni use the library? So Boab's library, all the libraries are currently closed because of the pandemic. Typically, alumni get one free visit per year with a valid alumni card. There's also some e-resources that alumni can use. You can find out more about those at alumni.nyu.edu. I'll pop that link in the chat for some e-resources for NYU alumni.
Yeah, just to add on to that, a lot of those e-resources that alumni have access to, and it's also true of a lot of the databases offered through the NYPL, the New York Public Library. They allow you to create your own individual profile. And within that profile, you can set alerts, kind of like I very briefly showed you in Google Scholar you can do. That can be really useful because if you have a topic that you're interested in, but you're not, it's not your life, but you are you're a curious person and you just want to kind of revisit it from time and time again, sending an alert to get an email once a month or whenever new information on this topic comes up, it's a way to kind of leverage a little bit more than just knowing that these databases exist. You can really kind of get it to do a little bit more work for you.
Excellent, thank you. Someone asked if it's possible to explain more about citing expectations.
Citing expectations? Or
citing,
oh,
I think that's what they meant. Yes.
Yes, sure. Yeah. No, that's there's a risk of rabbit holing with this. Looking at who cited it and what it was cited by. Hopefully the citations are all kind of relevant to the topic. Sometimes that may not be the case depending on the research topic itself. But it's a good way to kind of see, what sort of attention this type of research is getting. So they can be really handy, and it's nice that Google Scholar kind of provides that right away with its search results. And you can see here, it shows it. We looked at that one article, and it showed that it was cited by 268 different types of articles or book chapters. And then from there, we can see how those were cited. So this is kind of the rabbit hole effect that we want to avoid, of just kind of going through and seeing, cited by whom, cited by whom, cited by whom. Can get a bit unwieldy. Having said that, this is where, we did a search, we showed like that find feature, advanced search feature in Adobe Acrobat. We could do the same thing in our browser. So with a very general topic like homelessness and mental illness, it makes sense that we'd see a lot because there's I mean, those are very big kind of macro concepts. And mental illness, you know, it's schizophrenia, it's anxiety, it's depression. There's so many different aspects of it. So we can see that it fans out pretty broadly. But if we search within our internet browser with like a control find or command find, if you're using a Mac, we can search for those specific aspects of it that we're really interested in. And that can help inform what we're looking for a little bit better, a little bit more acutely. Trying to think other cautions and kind of ways to kind of use the citing. If you're using other databases, it might be better than Google Scholar, because Google Scholar is a bit broader. It's a search engine, not a database, and I think it's an important distinction to make here. Looking at what we're seeing on my screen right now with Google Scholar, the only real thing that we can do with this is limit the filters by when things were published, and not much more than that. But if we were to search a database, say Academic Search Premier, the first one on this list, they're able to leverage a little bit more detail out of the database, out of the results in the database. So like say subject headings and things like that. Don't look at my password. This is where you can find a little bit more detail on the metadata about the articles. And that's also something that you might be able to leverage better than you would in Google Scholar or something like that.
Thank you. Someone asked, if you are working with a physical book or other physical item, what do you suggest for turning it into a PDF that you can highlight and manipulate?
Ooh, okay. So that's a really great question. And if you are kind of doing it DIY style, hopefully you have a smartphone. And if you do, the one way is, which wouldn't necessarily convert into a PDF, is just use your camera and take a photo of it. That's fine, but there are apps on both Android and Apple phones. The one that I use from time to time, let me just pull it up on my phone really quick. It's called Genius Scan. It's free, but there's also a premium version. Test the free version out, decide if you want to go with the premium version. My partner teaches middle school and uses that often when it's has to convert like textbooks into PDFs for students. The one kind of drawback with that is you're taking it's basically a photo of the print text. So what we saw today in terms of being able to search for kind of signal words and things like that, we wouldn't be able to do because it's just basically a photo in PDF form. You can, though, do the highlighting of the different sections, all those sorts of aspects you would be able to do. It just might be a little less refined is what we saw today with the electronic version of a PDF or electronic version of an article. But Genius Scan is a pretty good app that I use on occasion for basically transferring a print version of something and turning it into a PDF. So have steady hands as you take your photo of the text.
Thank you. Okay, questions are flying in. We probably have time for one or two more. Okay. Someone asked, what do you do in the case where you're researching a historical figure and there are very different sources citing different experiences or dates that have occurred, maybe some conflict? How do you suss out the truth?
Okay. So I think to kind of peel this back a little bit, one thing to think about here would be like where you're starting your search and for that historical figure. So again, like looking at some of the databases that we found that are available through the New York Public Library, this is where like some of those reference databases can be really useful because we're just trying to get that background information on a person or an event. And oftentimes, though, that background information in those reference databases and texts will provide us the references to explore a little bit further. So let me just toggle back to that list of databases, and I'll specifically pull up Credo reference as an example, just so we can kind of see how that works. In the interest of time, we can look at, there are several databases on this list that could be useful, but just for right now, we'll just use this one because, again, interest of time. So we have lots of, so here we have like biographies and things like that. So if we went with Nabokov, for instance, we can click on this result. And here we even looking at this, there are different results. There's over 1,300 results that we can choose from, and we can limit that by subject area. So maybe we're not interested in him as an author, but his impact in literature. So then we could limit that based on this category, and then that might be useful for us. For now, I'll just kind of click on that first result, just so we can see what we're getting here. So it gives us some historical information. And as we scroll down to the bottom, just so you kind of get to the gist of this, it gives us the background information behind how this was constructed. So these were all the places where they were able to pull that information about Nabokov for this entry in Credo reference. So that can be useful for kind of deconstructing how this information was put together. So that's something that might be useful when it comes to that sort of thing. But again, like it's kind of relying on some of these sources, these reference materials, for getting that first start. And then if you want to kind of get a deeper dive, get more critical, kind of finding some of these sources to go further. But the good thing about this, with this reference material, they've already done a lot of that work for us. So if there is kind of disputes of like dates and things like that, the hope is that they've already kind of addressed those issues in this entry. But that's a really good question.
Awesome. Someone asked, are there citation manager softwares you'd recommend that integrate well into Microsoft Word for managing hundreds of citations across multiple projects?
Yes. The free one is Zotero. It's open source. It works very well. It's there's a web version and there's also software that you can download. It's the nice thing about that, because it's open source, you can use it on your Mac, on your PC. It's updated frequently by communities of researchers all over the world, frankly. And it's been around for decades, so it's not like something that's going to like disappear anytime soon, because people's research is on it, so they don't want it to go away. So there's definitely an investment in keeping it going. It works well with Microsoft Word. It also works well with Google Docs. So if you're a fan of Google Docs, there's an add-on that you can set up that speaks to your Zotero account. So that can be really useful as well. And I believe for NYU alumni, an alternative to that is ProQuest's RefWorks. So that's another, they basically do the same thing. So there's really no main difference between the two. Well, there's one difference. The main difference is that RefWorks is web-based, so it's no software that needs to be downloaded, so it's completely cloud storage. So you just basically create an account and then you're all set. Keep in mind that because it's completely web-based, you need the internet to make it work. So if that, during like storm seasons and things like that, where power can be an issue, you may want to keep that in mind when you're looking at those sort of things. But Zotero is a pretty solid and reliable open source software and citation manager that works well with Microsoft Word and Google Docs.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen, we have one more question I think is a great note to end on. And that question is, how do you set time management regarding reading and researching?
Aha, yes. So one way to think about that is, and before I say that, just make sure Zotero, it's Zotero, because I know I sometimes I muddle myself as I speak. But in terms of managing that research phase versus that reading phase, the reading phase I think tends to be the more time consuming and kind of requires the most kind of focus. Whereas when we research, like when we're searching a database and things like that, or searching Google Scholar, we're just kind of going through things and just kind of skimming and just deciding what looks good. Um, what I would recommend is kind of chunking things out in blocks of time, like 20 minutes on, 5 minutes off. And that would be true with any of those different active reading types. So with with the overviews, 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off, you're going to go through 5 articles or maybe more, 5 or 8 articles at a time, take a break for 5 minutes just to kind of stretch, kind of shift your eyes a little bit, maybe go back and look at that why you revisit the why you're looking at this research in the first place, and then get back into it. So kind of blocking out time in that way can be useful, and it just kind of it allows you to kind of take a break as you're reading through a lot of this content. It's a lot of it's unwieldy, and you all already know that in how you answer the question about your previous experience with research literature. It can feel overwhelming, jargon heavy, and yeah, it's a lot. So taking breaks between the time is a good way of doing that. And then when it comes to doing the research part of it, like actually doing the searching and stuff, again, setting blocks of time is just good practice, because you don't want to run the rabbit hole effect is real. And if you just set a 20 minute block, 25-minute block, and then just stop yourself and say, okay, what have I done? I've searched through this number of articles. Am I getting closer to what I'm looking for? And use maybe that 5-minute break to kind of reflect on that. And if you're feeling like, this isn't really getting I'm not really happy with what I'm getting here, maybe the next 20 minutes will be time to kind of explore the search terms that you're using. And maybe you want to like kind of fiddle with them a little bit, and maybe think of other ways, alternative keywords, alternative ways of saying what you're trying to look for. But I think chunking out the time into blocks can be really useful for that.
I believe it's referred to as the Pomodoro method.
Yes, that's right.
I use that a lot in my own work.
Yeah.
So when I saw this question, it kind of struck a good nerve with me.
Yeah.
Anyway, I have put in the chat a link to our Ask a Librarian service. If you have research-based questions, I got to most questions today, but if you have questions that were not answered, please feel free to reach out to Ask a Librarian for your research-based questions. Thank you everyone so much for coming.
Yes, thank you.
I want to remind you that this has been recorded, and if you've RSVP'd, a link will be emailed to you in the coming days, so you can go back and kind of dig right back into this. Again, use the Ask a Librarian chat if you have research questions. And thank you, Stephen, so much for your presentation.
Thanks,
this was
everyone.
so helpful. And we are so grateful. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Happy researching.